Hi, everyone. Welcome to our webinar today. This is part one of strategies for securing the grid through segmentation and isolation. This will be a two-part webinar series. The second one will be next Thursday at 11 a.m. to 11:30 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, and we'll be sure to send everyone the details and how to sign up for that one. Today we have Admiral Michael Brown and Paulo Silva, and the webinar will be hosted by Scott Coleman from OWL. Paulo Silva is the CEO of Security Limits, and Admiral Michael Brown is retired of the Navy and works for Spinnaker Security. So I'm gonna hand over the webinar now to Scott Coleman.
All right, thanks, Aileen. Welcome, everybody. So just as we get started here, I just want to let you know what we're sort of hoping to achieve and get out of today's webinar. We're looking at why the health system is a good place to model for cybersecurity, looking at some of the DHS recommendations, NERC SIP recommendations, basically some of the regulations that are help form best practices for the industry in deployment of cybersecurity, looking at isolation and segmentation, looking at how we design cybersecurity into a rollout of technology rather than sort of an afterthought or bolt-on. And then Paul's going to take us through some real-world examples of a private cloud architecture that's supporting operations technology across all the different types of applications in those networks. So as Aileen just said, Michael Brown is joining us. Rear Admiral, U.S. Navy, retired, served in a lot of interesting capacities during his tour of duty for us, and appreciate his service to us. Normally wouldn't think of the Navy and what does that have to do with cybersecurity, but certainly he's held very interesting roles at the DHS while serving, and a number of different task force, et cetera. And you can see his resume there, including participation in RSA, which we all know is a real guiding force in terms of cybersecurity. So welcome to Michael today. And we're also joining us is Paulo Silva, co-founder and CEO of Security Limits. This is a company that has built a tremendous architecture in terms of helping our utilities, power generation utilities in building and rethinking about the way cybersecurity should be implemented and rolled out across an organization. Okay, so agenda real quickly. We're going to go through, Admiral Brown is going to take us through healthcare precautions and methods and how that relates back to best practices in government and critical infrastructure around modeling, like we said, modeling healthcare around sort of, and obviously it's very relevant today. So we look at the things that are happening with the COVID virus and how we're distancing or segmenting ourselves and how we're doing one-way transfers, i.e. the Uber Eats drivers going from the store to your house and dropping off the food. You're not going to the store. So again, one-way communications, one-way deliveries. So there's a lot of parallels around what's happening in healthcare today and how that's applicable to cybersecurity. And obviously, we don't call computer viruses we do that for a good reason. After we get through with Michael's perspective, we're going to jump into, I'm going to describe a little bit about DHS and NERC SIP and how that works with segmentation and diodes. And then Paulo's going to wrap up with the real world applications of these technologies and these theories. Okay, so again, welcome, Admiral Brown. Can you share with us a little bit about some of the things, your experiences in terms of what you saw in terms of mitigation and containment and how that relates from the healthcare perspective back over to cybersecurity?
Absolutely. First, thanks, Scott, and to Paulo for inviting me to talk this morning. I really appreciate it. When I think about where we are right now with COVID-19, it's almost like we're back to the future. As you said a little while ago, the lexicon that we use, and in fact, the strategies that have been employed for cybersecurity originally were based upon the healthcare system. And as I've been helping folks over the last several months, not necessarily on the cybersecurity issue, but more around how to help in the crisis response with respect to COVID-19, it dawned on me again that, you know, we're back to the future where now we're also employing the strategies that have proven effective from a cybersecurity perspective now into the healthcare system itself. So what we're used to is obviously, and what we have seen here in COVID-19 is initially response. And that's exactly what we did with the cybersecurity perspective. As you said, viruses, whether they're from a healthcare perspective or from a computer perspective, it was because we were in fact responding to some malicious activity, some abnormal activity. And so the first thing we do is try to fight that that specific activity that's ongoing. Again, whether it's inside the computer infrastructure itself, as in the past, as well as what we've been doing over the last couple of months, which is truly mitigation. You know, it's crisis response. So what happened is, as I was at DHS, and we were constantly fighting every day the new viruses, the new attack vectors, the new things that were impacting either inside the government or in the private sector, our ability to conduct the mission or business. And what hit us was, as we were literally having conversations that we're constantly the first responders. We're like the first responders in an ambulance going to respond to activity. And that just does not scale. And so what we said was we needed to start thinking from a cybersecurity strategy the way the healthcare system did, which included things like prevention, the ability for doctors to do regular checkups based on an understanding of an individual patient's chronic conditions. And that led us to think about, okay, we need to have situational awareness and to really understand our infrastructure, just like we really need to understand our body and what we have the potential to be susceptible for. And as I said, the situational awareness piece allowed us to then build the prevention that we were looking at. So when I think about hygiene, both again in medical and cybersecurity terms, it is about prevention. One of the things that you'll be talking about a little later is the use and application of data diodes. That is in fact basic hygiene from a cybersecurity perspective. After several years of balancing and building a strategy around prevention and response, we worked to develop the cybersecurity framework. And everybody that's heard the cybersecurity framework understands that there's the 5 major functional areas of identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. And that is a direct correlation to the healthcare system itself. And if you think about what we've been doing for COVID-19, whether it's been treatment, tracing, testing, all fits into this overall framework. One thing that we're well aware of is, and what we are watching now with COVID-19, coronavirus has been around for decades, but it mutates. That's the same thing we fight from a cybersecurity perspective. Malware is around, has been around, but the malicious actors mutate and try to attack the new weaknesses. And so that's why when we look at both from a healthcare perspective and a cybersecurity perspective, we need to employ segmentation in isolation. And obviously that's been highlighted over the last couple of months as we in the US and around the world have been fighting against COVID-19. That's been a strategy that we've been using from a cybersecurity perspective. And obviously both you, Scott, and Paulo will be talking more in depth about that as we move along. So finally, one of the things, again, that we've learned, and that's why I keep saying it's like being back to the future, that one of our vulnerabilities here in COVID-19 has been the supply chain. Whether or not the material is in fact trustworthy and dependable, and most importantly, is it available? And so most recently, I think it was just last week, from a cybersecurity perspective, the president signed an executive order stating that our industrial control systems and electric grid, in order to ensure that we have the trustworthiness and dependability that's necessary to ensure operations, that only U.S. companies may be able to be, and their technology may be able to be employed and deployed in the grid. You're going to see, I really believe this, a lot more of that tied to the healthcare system and the supply chain itself. So again, when I look at this in perspective, and as we're actually acting to support what's going on in COVID-19, the similarities between strategy and lexicon are there, the actions are there, and I think that that's how we are going to be successful, both in the fight against COVID-19 and in our preparations for the future, where we know there will be new and mutated viruses coming down the pike, as well as from a cybersecurity perspective, where we need to take the proper actions in both prevention and response to be able to ensure our critical infrastructure is there for us day in and day out. So I'll stop right there, Scott, and happy to be part of today's event and look forward to the rest of it.
Thanks, Mike. Yeah, I think one of the things we've been talking to customers about, we've been talking about Department of Homeland Security guidelines for a number of years now, and I think it's been hard for people to relate to that to their situation. But now, if we're able to compare that to like the CDC issuing recommendations saying, here's how you should protect yourself, and then you compare that to the DHS, which has been saying, here's how to protect your critical infrastructure, I think it gives people a way to help correlate. It makes it real for them. So I appreciate your perspective on that. All right, so I'm going to go through quickly here some compliance things. So speaking of the DHS, they actually issued a paper several years ago now about the 7 strategies for basically protecting critical infrastructure and industrial control systems. And those strategies around application whitelisting, configuration management, reducing your attack surface, see there. And they said basically if these strategies have been employed, that in 98% of the cases that were reported to them, they would have stopped the intruders and they would have stopped the attack. So very effective in that respect. The ones that we're really talking about in terms of segmentation and isolation is around reducing and eliminating, creating connections in and out of the network. So there's connections that you don't need any longer, and that's one of the first recommendations is get rid of those connections you don't need. Convert two-way connections to one-way because it gives you absolute control over them. And now you've got physical directions, and Paulo is going to talk about that quite a bit. Converting two-way connections to one-way into the plant. So how do you get patches, updates, etc. into the plant? And then for those two-way connections that remain, ways to secure those. The other standard I want to talk about briefly is NERC SIP. There's a NERC talks about a number of requirements, how to ensure protection of those assets, talking about a strong security perimeter, protecting the bulk electric system, right, from external connections, and then again, limiting and reducing protocols and connections and all those things. Same emphasis, same path, it's basically reduce and control, right? Everyone has limited resources. How do you apply those resources to those things you want to control? And I would mention that we do have a white paper on that, addressing NERC compliance for anyone who's interested in the resource library on our website. And then talking about diodes themselves and how they work. So they're a one-way communication device based on hardware. There is a physical LED shining light across that diode. There's no way to send light backwards because there's only one LED. There's no way to go back. So it's literally physically impossible to hack a data diode because of that, because of the technology inside. The technology to send light backwards or basically being able to cross that network doesn't exist. And so no zero-day exploit, no virus, no anything can spontaneously create or replace missing components, hardware components. And that's really why it can't be hacked. And then you've got, of course, have software proxies that allow it to talk to the networks around it. And that's important because most networks today are two-way and diodes are one-way, but it's those proxies that allow that communication to persist. And then people always ask about use cases. There's a lot of different use cases around diodes. Here I've got a generation turbine, sending data out through the diode, remote monitoring while preventing threat actors from getting in. And other use cases are for DNP3, IEC 104, SIM data, historia replication, et cetera, et cetera. All of these things are part of the Ironclad solution. Okay, so at this point, I'm gonna pass it off to Paulo, and he's gonna run us through what his organization does, what they do, and how they build much more secure architectures.
Okay, thank you very much, Scott. That was very useful. My name is Paulo Silva, and I'm the creator of a product called Ironclad. And I'm gonna be walking you through some real-world examples of this particular solution. One of the things that we have done that's very unique is that we've taken a back-of-the-napkin blue sky approach in respect to cybersecurity. So typically, if you look at power plants, WAN networks, IT, OT infrastructures, traditionally, we used to really be able to segregate both environments. And but over time, that became extremely difficult in the way utilities operate. So one of the things that we have done is really focus on, should we try and create additional products, cybersecurity products, services, and try to band-aid and patch an infrastructure that's extremely inadequate, right, from a cybersecurity protection framework perspective, or should we really, rethink the entire approach? So one of the things that we have done now is we've taken a step back and we decided to rethink it. Next slide. There you go. So one of the things that what we have on the screen here is a traditional IT/OT infrastructure. You ended up with your, what we call the connectivity cloud. That's basically your IT/OT infrastructure, your WAN. Some way or another today, it's all commingled, right? So you may have a fiber optic network infrastructure, an optical transport network that has different circuits with different service providers. You have egress points through those service providers, because sometimes you may have multiple companies, multiple services being provided by those same devices. And in most cases, utilities have no control of those devices, right? If you need anything changed, you would have to reach out to the service providers. So what we've done is we've taken an approach where we looked at the OSI model and we started applying good cybersecurity architecture, design and engineering practices from layer 1 all the way up to layer 7. So what that basically means is, traditionally now, if you look at your networks, you may end up with an IT OT WAN infrastructure that's fully converged. But if you look historically, how did you achieve that conversion? You realize that cybersecurity, or either physical security protection services or cybersecurity services, were not really ingrained within the fabric of how you design your infrastructure. If you're a large utility today, like one of the large utilities we've been working with in the Northeast, you have gone through many mergers and acquisitions over the years, and during those mergers and acquisitions, you ended up absorbing or integrating assets into your existing environment that sometimes may be more better protected, or sometimes you absorb those assets that have very little protection, right, during those mergers and acquisitions. which makes it extremely difficult to go back and try to retrofit information security protection services and technologies within those architectures, right? Because you fix one thing and you plug a hole and then there's another hole that's open, and like the Admiral was saying, you're constantly in reactionary mode, right? You're always responding to crisis. You're always trying to protect the network, but you really don't have a lot of time to put a lot of emphasis on how do we really solve, what kind of preventive measures we can put in place. So with that being said, next slide. Yeah. There you go. Yeah, so if you look at the next slide, you ended up now with the a cloud G Suite connected to a corporate headquarters. This is a traditional thing that's happening now. Utilities have been migrating a lot of services onto the public cloud. These are primarily productivity application tools. It could be your workforce workday for either your HR systems, payroll. Some companies are actually outsourcing the production of regulatory compliance requirements pertaining to publicly traded companies. Like, for example, companies like Board in the cloud actually now, they're able to actually meet all of the federal, state filing requirements on behalf of utilities if you outsource those services to them. The question becomes, well, if you have to outsource those critical services to them, especially when it comes to financial reporting, as an example, how do you secure that connection, right? You still need to go through some kind of either proprietary fiber network, or sometimes some utilities have chosen to go directly through the internet, and accepting the risks for the lesser reliability of services of communications, if you will. And eventually they engage with these cloud service providers, but that's another interconnect that if you are a CISO, CIO, or even the board members of these companies, you need to start worrying about, who am I connecting to, which goes back to what the Admiral mentioned about supply chain. So all of that comes together. So it just shows that there are many different challenges in respect to how we address these intercommunications and how do we segment the network, especially trying to protect critical infrastructure from an OT perspective. So if you can go to next slide. One of the approach that we have done is build a private cloud architecture. So Ironclad is basically a data center in a box, in a very simplistic way. It's a data center that we assemble and integrate layer 1 through layer 7 offsite, and we deliver these data centers to any of your existing data centers. So it's a brand new data center infrastructure, which consists of approximately 10 to 15 cabinets per site. And the overall Ironclad architecture comes with a dev environment, a QA, two production environments, and a disaster recovery site. They are all built exactly the same. We have protective measures at layer 1 with the DWDMs. We can accommodate partners like Nokia, Cisco equipment. We configured, we protect, we enable layer 1 encryption, and that would be at layer 1. Then we address data link layer, right? So that's the switching layer. We actually interconnect and configure all of those systems all the way up to the various applications and partners that we have, including, the data diodes. Now, what makes you very unique about the architecture is that when we built this architecture, we're not trying to retrofit or apply one of the 3,000 cybersecurity products that exist in the marketplace today into your existing data centers, because most of you are already doing that, right? So in your organizations, you're already deploying your F5s, your firewalls. You have a series of security controls and measures that you have deployed in your legacy infrastructure. One of the things that's very unique, if you look at the graphic there, is that we build a private cloud. And one of the things that's very unique within that private cloud is that the way the architecture is being integrated with all of our partners that makes up Ironclad, we actually took a step further, and within our design, we have what's called CADAs, with the centralized architecture design and engineering services. So if you're a large utility in the United States and you went through mergers and acquisitions, You may be operating in such a way today that you may have 5 operating companies. If you Duke Energy, for example, right? You could have 5 recent acquisitions. You absorb those assets, and then through the absorption of those assets, you ended up with a design and engineering team at each of those utilities with their own budgets, with their own, and eventually try to do all of this financial stuff, which is part of segue into part 2. We're going to talk about how you capitalize and fund this solution, and actually add value to shareholders while you're doing this and protecting critical infrastructure. But one of the things is, if you look, we've taken segmentation and isolation one step further. And in that step, we built these data centers, and we put these data centers inside your existing facility. So you tell us where we deliver them. So once these data centers are fully operational, the data centers are built air gap, never connected to the internet. In fact, we have military-grade portable media drives that are delivered to the facility, and we actually use those portable media drives with all of the software updates to actually do the install. We certify the hardware of the architecture prior to the installation. All of the people that make up the architecture, these are all US-based companies. It's American-made 100%, okay? And we have over 60 partners within this architecture, okay? It's too many to put here on the screen, but just to give you the magnitude of what we have built. For example, in the architecture, we made sure that we didn't really pick one single company or one single product for providing network segmentation services, or for providing vulnerability management or incident response. What we've done is we really created a hybrid system where we took the best-in-class tools, but we're never really utilizing the same tool across different segments of the architecture. So Ironclad is built on a zero trust model with 15 isolation zones. So what that means is we're running checkpoint firewalls, for example, in the critical zone, non-critical zone, shared services, which is part of the core of the OT protection network. And then we are actually deploying F5, which is another brand of firewall technology, on the outer perimeter, right? So now if somebody compromises code, if there's a vulnerability in the checkpoint system, you ended up with a different class of product that's part of that overall hybrid set of toolkit, if you will. One of the things that we've done then is, from a segmentation perspective, it's to take the protection services of data diodes, and we're not protecting just the data centers. We're actually taking that technology now and deploying through what's called a meet me point cabinet technology, where we deploy security controls that are compatible to this private cloud architecture, and we put the security controls at every site and every utility. So we're now protecting each site from a cybersecurity and physical security perspective, not just the head-end systems and the data centers, which is very unique, right? So we're not focusing on the core. We're actually taking the security out to the field, to every site of every utility, based on these particular services. Yep. Next, eventually when you build this architecture, one of the things that we provide is a migration services. So you built this private cloud brand new. The fiber optic that network that connects to it is also brand new. It's a 100G fiber network. We connect these 5 data centers together, and it does not interconnect with the legacy systems for a while. We have what's called an orchestration services, and then we create a schedule that orderly starts migrating your critical applications. So for example, for a large utility in the Northeast, we're in the process now of migrating physical access control and video, right? Because we want to relieve the video traffic that's really saturating the bandwidth on the fiber optic network of utilities today. We want to take that video traffic now and route it through a brand new fiber optic network into the Ironclad data centers, right? So that we can do video analytics through the SOC, and the system is delivered, like I said, fully operational. On day one, it's NERC CIP compliant. We actually audit the systems before we deliver them to you, and the systems are delivered with a run book, fully documented from a people, technology, and process across layer 1 through layer 7. Eventually, the objective is to allow these companies to migrate SCADA into the Ironclad platform without having any disruptions to existing operations, because you start building a fiber optic network and you start bringing in new sites It could be a lower level, substation that you would interconnect to the Ironclad design, and then you would have SCADA, whether using a Terra control platform, right? If you Alstom, you would connect to these substations and run them for a little while. These substations would be non-critical, and after you're really satisfied with the performance of your SCADA system, that's when you start now migrating the other sites, once again through a brand new interconnect fiber optic network, 100% air gapped. So with that being said, it's, Ironclad, it's a very proactive cybersecurity design. We have AI technology, true AI in the core, the best in breed technology, artificial intelligence products, fully integrated and delivered, fully operational. It's a modular network design, so we can provide different design packages for your companies, even for protecting your existing legacy infrastructure. We have over 3,000 blueprints and visual diagrams and very detailed architecture, really well documented, that we provide as a service. We provide real-time incident response, threat and vulnerability management through IronNet, which is General Keith Alexander's product. I don't know if you guys are familiar with IronNet, but they provide this Iron Dome capability where utilities can actually share real-time incident and event response data. Okay, and then respond collectively within the dome. We have many partnerships with industry leaders, and if you guys have any questions, I'll wrap it up here. Scott, I'll give it back to you. One of the no problem.
Finish up. Go ahead.
No, I'm good. You can cover the some of the lessons learned.
Okay, so Aileen, so thanks, Paulo, for that. So why don't we see if there's any questions that came in during the webinar? We can answer those, and if not, then maybe Paulo, you can share some lessons learned from your deployments.
Sure thing. Thank you, Paulo, Scott, and Michael Brown. So we did get a few questions, and while the panelists are answering them, if you do have one that you haven't submitted, just to remind you, you can use the questions pane on the right toolbar and type your question in, and it will only come to us. So while I read off these questions, feel free to submit another one. So the first question we got was, how has NERC SIP influenced the Ironclad design?
Do you want to take that, Paulo?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So one of the things that we've done from the early stages of designing Ironclad is that we took a very hard look across all of the different regulatory compliance requirements and landscape, not just for utilities, but overall for companies. Because a lot of times these regulatory compliance requirements, they address really minimum security requirements, right? Because they have to level set the playing field for all companies. Some companies have very big budgets, some companies don't. And if you were to make that too stringent, it would be very difficult for them to implement. So one of the things that we've done is that when we build Ironclad, the zero trust model, for example, right, and the 15 isolation zones, that's very specific to NERC SIP, right, in respect to, creating and protecting an electronic security perimeter, right, within SIP 5. And we also put very specific controls in place that required a tremendous amount of effort with our vendors to make sure that we were getting software packages in a secure format, right, that was actually portable, but we were not actually connected to the internet while we're building the system, right? So when we finished the architecture, and we actually have gone live now with a major utility in the Northeast, it's fully operational and in production. It is the first private cloud purpose-built hyper-converged infrastructure built for companies that are hosting industrial control systems.
Thanks, Paulo. So I see we're actually a couple of minutes over our 30 minutes. Aileen, maybe one more question, and then what we can do is we will, when we distribute the slides, because people are usually interested in getting a copy of the slides, we'll also include any other questions that have come in with the answers. I don't want to intrude on people's time. So Aileen, maybe one more question, and then we'll wrap it up with that.
Sure, we just had another question come in. Does Ironclad have its common criteria certification as a package? Or
It does.
component have its certification?
Yes, it does. We do. We have a physical component certification within the Ironclad design. We also provide the processes, fully documented processes in respect to supply chain. Right, that's a big thing on NERC CIP right now. That's going to begin enforcement actually very soon, and I know that companies are very concerned about that. So what's very unique is that we've taken all of the certification processes. For example, Ironclad is C2M2. We have employed within the architecture itself, continuous mitigation, the continuous diagnostic and mitigation, the CDM, right? Recommendations from DHS. The system is NERC CIP compliance. It's Sarbanes-Oxley compliance for companies that are publicly traded. And we also, when we deliver the system to your companies, we deliver it with a fully documented package. And there's an orchestration process. This is not something that we do within 1 year, right? We built the systems typically within 12 months. And the whole transition from a capitalization of the project all the way to OPEX, to operations within the utility, is about a 2 to 3 year life cycle, right? Because it's really, we're changing the infrastructure within the utility itself over time. But when we deliver the system, it is also ISO 27001 certified, independently certified.
So yeah, so there's a lot there. Assuming there's a couple more questions, Aileen, or is that it?
We just got one more. Maybe we can answer.
Because we do. I was just thinking we do have the opportunity next week. We can recap some of these questions, and maybe we'll do that anyways. But go ahead. If we've got another one, go ahead. Let's squeeze it in.
Okay. So this person said IronNet shares threat intelligence through attack indicators like STIX. Does Ironclad come up with specific controls for those, especially in cloud environments?
Yeah, yeah. So that's a very good question, right? So I can't divulge now too much details around that. We do have the capability, and we're actually having discussions about that with IronNet. One of the things that's very interesting through our partnership with IronNet is that we're looking at this private cloud architecture to help utilities help steer off utilities from having communications to public clouds, right? So if you're going to really connect and you need to exchange data, or you need to exchange, threat information, right, between the utilities. Right now, a lot of those services are being provided within the Iron Dome, right, which is an AWS service. One of the things that we're trying to do now is say, okay, well, what if we were to begin providing Ironclad, the architecture, right, the basis for the utility, and then you start working with all these vendors to actually host their codes within the architecture itself, whether it's for threat data or for patch data, right? The vendors were actually coming to this Ironclad architecture that utilities would connect via a private fiber optic network, and we would provide the patches available within this private network, right, directly to the utilities, or the threat data, because all of the vendors that are our partners would be hosting their code within our what's called the energy sector private cloud. And that's one of the things that it's still work in progress right now. There's a major initiative underway in respect to investments. And eventually, I think those are the services that we will be providing. And I hope that helps answer the question a little bit. But it's
Paul,
definitely.
Can I just add something on that? So the STIX protocol is obviously a very important protocol for, as you just said, sharing threat information. Part of the reason for having NERC CIP compliance and working with the other best practices in such with DHS, it was in fact to be able to take advantage of that. And in conjunction with that, part of what our strategy is to make sure that we have the ability to exchange information, indicators, and so on via STIX taxi, and especially as they move to the second version and on. I participate in some of that. And as we look at the Cyber Threat Alliance and really having a visibility into the malicious activity that's out there and the threats, and also getting context around that. All of that's very important and fundamental to the approach that Paulo has taken with Ironclad and with the products and services that you see comprise the overall architecture itself.
Perfect. Yeah, so I definitely want to respect people's time at this point. So Admiral Brown, thank you for A, that follow-up, and B, your perspective at the beginning of the session. Paulo, obviously, thank you very much. You got a lot of information to share. We will be having part 2 next week. We mentioned we're getting into more of the financial sides, like how are the folks that Paulo's working with, how are they financing this? You know, what does the procurement cycle look like? What is the things like the package, you know, what is provided when you engage with this application. So we will recap any of the questions that we didn't get to this week when we email out the slides, and we will have the opportunity next week's webinar to also add or answer additional questions. So thank you to everybody for your participation today, and we look forward to hearing you or meeting with you next week same time. Take care.
Thank you. And this will be emailed out to everyone, a recording, so that you can go back and listen to certain parts if you'd like. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.